he was in a hurry, and because I guess it was raining, he wanted to get this undercover.
So you weren't here when Dylan came down here?
He's a friend of mine.
Sure. You don't get rid of friends.
Before he vanished without a trace, 19-year-old Dylan Rounds had one dream: to build a successful farm in the remote Utah desert. But after one final phone call to his grandmother, he disappeared. His truck was left behind, his equipment sat untouched, and for nearly 2 years, no one knew what had happened. The truth would eventually reveal a shocking murder, a hidden burial site, and a killer living just next door. If you appreciate well-researched true crime stories and real criminal investigations, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Now, let's uncover the tragic disappearance and murder of Dylan Rounds. Dylan Rounds was born in 2002 and grew up in Idaho, where he developed a passion for farming at an unusually young age. While many teenagers were still deciding what they wanted to do with their lives, Dylan already knew exactly where his future lay. He loved tractors, heavy machinery, open fields, and the challenge of growing crops from the ground up. Family members often described him as independent, hardworking, and determined to build something of his own. Rather than following a traditional career path, Dylan chose agriculture. Those closest to him said farming wasn't simply a job to him, it was his dream. He spent years learning everything he could about operating equipment, planting crops, and managing farmland. His goal was ambitious for someone so young, but Dylan believed that with enough hard work, he could build a successful farming business from the ground up. That dream eventually brought him to one of the most isolated places in the western United States. Near the Utah-Nevada border lies a tiny community known as Lucin. The area is surrounded by vast stretches of desert, rugged mountains, dirt roads, and miles of open farmland. Cell phone service is unreliable in many places. Neighbors often live miles apart, and help can take a long time to arrive. It was exactly the kind of place where someone looking for independence could start a farming operation, but it also carried obvious risks. In 2022, Dylan moved to Lucin to begin farming land in the remote desert. At just 19 years old, he was operating machinery, planting crops, and living largely on his own. His family supported his dream, even though they understood how isolated the location was. They remained in regular contact with him through phone calls and text messages, checking in as he worked to establish his first major crop. The spring of 2022 was especially important. Dylan had invested enormous effort into preparing his fields and planting grain before the growing season. Every day was filled with long hours operating tractors, repairing equipment, and working the dry Utah soil. According to family members, he was excited about finally seeing years of planning become reality. People who knew Dylan described him as responsible and dependable. Although he preferred the quiet life of farming, he maintained close relationships with his parents, grandparents, and siblings. It wasn't unusual for him to call family members after finishing work for the day, updating them on his progress or discussing plans for the farm. That routine continued into Memorial Day weekend. On May 28, 2022, Dylan spent much of the day working in his fields. According to those familiar with his schedule, he had been focused on finishing the planting of his first crop before weather conditions changed. Later that evening, he made what would become his final known phone call. He spoke with his grandmother. Nothing about the conversation immediately suggested that something was wrong. Like many of their previous conversations, they talked about farming and the work Dylan had been doing. Family members later recalled that he sounded normal and optimistic about the future. After the call ended, no one realized it would be the last time they would ever hear his voice. The following day, Dylan stopped responding to calls and text messages. At first, the silence didn't immediately trigger panic. Because he lived and worked in such a remote area, poor cell service occasionally interrupted communication. Friends and relatives knew there were times when he simply couldn't receive calls while operating machinery in distant fields. But as more time passed, concern began to grow. Family members continued trying to reach him. There was no answer. Messages went unread. Calls went directly to voicemail. For someone who usually stayed in contact, the silence was unusual. As concern turned into alarm, relatives decided to travel to Lucen themselves. When they arrived at Dylan's farm, several things immediately stood out. His truck was still on the property. His farming equipment remained where he had been working. Personal belongings appeared to have been left behind. To those who knew him, it made no sense. Dylan had dedicated everything to building his farm. Leaving voluntarily without taking essential belongings, or even telling his family where he was going, was completely out of character. His disappearance was reported to law enforcement, and an extensive search began almost immediately. Investigators, search and rescue teams, volunteers, and family members spread across the surrounding desert looking for any sign of the missing 19-year-old. The landscape made the search incredibly difficult. Lucen's remote terrain stretches for miles with dirt roads, abandoned structures, dry creek beds, and vast open desert. Temperatures can become extreme, visibility changes rapidly with weather conditions, and countless areas are accessible only by off-road vehicles. Despite hundreds of hours of searching, investigators found no immediate evidence explaining what had happened. There was no confirmed sighting of Dylan after his final phone call. There were no obvious signs that he had simply left the area on his own. Instead, detectives began examining everyone who had been living or working near Dylan's remote farm. One particular neighbor quickly drew their attention. His name was James Brenner. At first glance, Brenner appeared to be just another man living in the isolated desert. But investigators would soon discover that he was far from an ordinary neighbor. And as they continued examining the evidence, they began to suspect that the answer to Dylan Round's disappearance might have been much closer than anyone first imagined. As investigators expanded their search around Lucen, attention increasingly focused on 60-year-old James Brenner, a man who had been living in a trailer on property near Dylan's farm. Brenner was known to spend time around the isolated area, and investigators soon learned that he had a lengthy criminal history. His proximity to Dylan's property, combined with the unusual circumstances surrounding the disappearance, made him a person of immediate interest. Detectives began interviewing people who knew both men. According to investigators, Dylan and Brenner had interacted before, though their relationship was far from close. Family members later stated that Dylan had expressed concerns about Brenner's behavior and had tried to avoid unnecessary contact with him whenever possible. Living in such a remote area meant neighbors occasionally crossed paths, but those interactions were limited. As officers searched the surrounding properties, they started gathering physical and digital evidence that would significantly change the direction of the investigation. One of the most important discoveries involved Dylan's missing cell phone. After an extensive search, investigators recovered the device. Although it did not immediately reveal exactly what had happened to Dylan, forensic specialists extracted valuable data from it. Among the recovered files was a time-lapse video that quickly became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire case. According to court records, the video appeared to show James Brenner cleaning a firearm, while visible bloodstains could be seen on his clothing. Investigators immediately seized on the significance of the footage. The recording raised serious questions about what had occurred around the time Dylan disappeared and prompted detectives to intensify their investigation. The evidence continued to grow. Authorities recovered clothing believed to have been worn by Brenner. Forensic testing later identified Dylan Round's blood on a shirt connected to Brenner. Investigators also examined a pair of boots recovered near the property. Laboratory analysis found Dylan's DNA and blood on those boots as well. Each forensic result strengthened the prosecution's theory that Dylan had been the victim of a violent crime rather than an accidental disappearance. Digital evidence also helped investigators reconstruct Dylan's final known movements. Cell phone records showed that the last signal from Dylan's phone came from an area near a pond not far from where Brenner had been staying. Detectives carefully searched the surrounding terrain, hoping they might locate Dylan or uncover additional evidence explaining what had happened. Despite countless hours of searching, Dylan himself remained missing. The lack of a body created major challenges for investigators. Without recovering Dylan's remains, prosecutors would eventually have to rely heavily on forensic evidence, digital records, witness statements, and circumstantial facts to establish what they believed had occurred. As detectives continued interviewing witnesses, another possible motive emerged. According to investigators and statements later made by Dylan's family, the conflict between Dylan and Brenner may have started over something remarkably small. Authorities alleged that Brenner became angry because Dylan had parked one of his farm trucks inside a shed that Brenner believed he should not have been using. What appeared to outsiders to be an insignificant disagreement allegedly escalated into deadly violence. Investigators later argued that this minor dispute ultimately resulted in the murder of a 19-year-old farmer who had simply been trying to build his future. As months passed, search efforts continued across the Utah desert. Volunteers, law enforcement officers, specialized search teams, and Dylan's family refused to give up hope. Thousands of hours were spent searching fields, ponds, abandoned buildings, and remote desert locations. The case attracted growing national attention. News organizations across the United States covered the mysterious disappearance, highlighting the determination of Dylan's family and the unusual circumstances surrounding the investigation. Social media campaigns kept his photograph circulating, while volunteers continued organizing search efforts. For Dylan's parents, every passing day brought more uncertainty. Without answers, they continued pleading for information, urging anyone who might know something to come forward. They remained convinced that someone in the remote Lucin community knew exactly what had happened during Memorial Day weekend. Meanwhile, investigators quietly continued building their case. After reviewing the physical evidence, forensic testing, digital records, and witness interviews, prosecutors concluded they had enough evidence to formally accuse James Brenner of murder. In March 2023, nearly 10 months after Dylan disappeared, Brenner was officially charged with aggravated murder and desecration of a human body. The announcement marked a major turning point in the investigation. For the first time, authorities publicly stated they believed Dylan had been murdered. But despite filing homicide charges, investigators still faced one heartbreaking reality. They still had not found Dylan Rounds. His family now had a suspect, a criminal case, and growing forensic evidence pointing toward what investigators believed had happened. Yet the one thing they wanted most, the chance to bring Dylan home, remained painfully out of reach. The answers they had waited months to hear would not come until another year had passed, when an unexpected legal agreement would finally reveal what had been hidden in the Utah desert all along. For nearly 2 years after Dylan Rounds disappeared, his family lived with constant uncertainty. Although prosecutors had charged James Brenner with aggravated murder in March 2023, one heartbreaking question remained unanswered. Where was Dylan? Without recovering his remains, the family could not lay him to rest, and investigators could not fully reconstruct the final moments of his life. Search teams continued returning to the remote desert around Lucin, examining abandoned structures, dry washes, ponds, and isolated stretches of farmland. Every new lead was investigated, but none produced the breakthrough everyone hoped for. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors continued assembling the evidence they believed proved Brenner's guilt. The digital evidence from Dylan's phone, forensic testing that linked Dylan's blood to Brenner's clothing and boots, cell phone records, and witness statements all formed the foundation of the state's case. Still, investigators believed only one person knew where Dylan's body had been hidden. That person was James Brenner. By early 2024, discussions began between prosecutors and Brenner's defense attorneys regarding a possible plea agreement. Such agreements are often controversial, particularly in homicide cases, because they usually involve reducing charges or sentencing in exchange for critical information. For Dylan's family, the possibility of a plea deal created mixed emotions. On one hand, they wanted Brenner to face the maximum punishment possible. On the other, they desperately wanted to bring Dylan home. Ultimately, prosecutors reached an agreement that required Brenner to reveal the location of Dylan's remains. In April 2024, Brenner led investigators to a remote area near Lucin. After following his directions, authorities discovered human skeletal remains buried in the desert. The remains were later positively identified as those of Dylan Rounds. Nearly 2 years after he vanished, Dylan had finally been found. The discovery ended one of the largest unanswered questions in the investigation, but it also confirmed the tragic outcome his family had feared from the beginning. According to court proceedings, Dylan had died from multiple close-range gunshot wounds to the head. The medical findings reinforced prosecutors' position that the killing had been deliberate. For Dylan's parents, the recovery of their son's remains brought overwhelming grief, but it also brought a measure of closure. After spending countless days searching the desert themselves and refusing to give up hope, they were finally able to bring their son home. The plea agreement soon became official. In May 2024, James Brenner pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of second-degree murder. As part of the agreement, he also pleaded guilty to 2 counts of possession of a firearm by a restricted person. In return, prosecutors dismissed the charge of desecration of a human body. The agreement immediately generated public debate. Many people questioned why a defendant originally charged with aggravated murder would be allowed to plead guilty to a lesser offense. Prosecutors explained that recovering Dylan's remains had been a priority. Without Brenner's cooperation, there was no guarantee his family would ever know where he had been buried. For Dylan's parents, the decision was difficult to accept. Although they expressed disappointment that Brenner would not stand trial on the original murder charge, they acknowledged that finally recovering Dylan's body meant everything to their family. It was a painful compromise. Justice, they believed, could never fully replace the life that had been taken. But bringing Dylan home ended nearly 2 years of agonizing uncertainty. The criminal proceedings were now entering their final stage. The remaining question was how much time James Brenner would ultimately spend behind bars, and whether the court's sentence would satisfy a family that had fought tirelessly for answers. The final chapter of the Dylan Rounds case unfolded in July 2024, when James Brenner appeared in court for sentencing. More than 2 years had passed since Dylan disappeared while pursuing his dream of becoming a successful farmer in the remote Utah desert. What had begun as a missing person investigation had become a homicide case that drew national attention and left an entire community searching for answers. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors described the devastating impact of Brenner's actions. They argued that Dylan was a hardworking 19-year-old who had spent years preparing for a future in agriculture. He had moved hundreds of miles from home to build a life through determination and hard work, only for that future to be taken away. Members of Dylan's family also addressed the court. They spoke about the pain of not knowing where their son was for nearly 2 years, the endless searches across the desert, and the emotional toll of waiting for answers that never seemed to come. Although they were grateful that Dylan's remains had finally been recovered, they made it clear that no sentence could erase what their family had lost. The court accepted the terms of the plea agreement. James Brenner was sentenced on the second-degree murder conviction, along with the firearm offenses to which he had pleaded guilty. Under Utah law, the individual mandatory prison terms were ordered to run consecutively, resulting in an overall sentence of 3 to 30 years in prison. The sentence sparked mixed reactions. Some believed the punishment was too lenient considering that prosecutors had originally charged Brenner with aggravated murder. Others understood that the plea agreement had achieved something investigators could not accomplish for almost 2 years. It led directly to Dylan's remains and finally allowed his family to bring him home. Prosecutors noted that Brenner's age was also a practical consideration. At around 60 years old when sentenced, they stated that he would likely spend the remainder of his life in prison despite the formal sentencing range. For Dylan's family, however, the legal outcome could never replace the life that had been stolen. They have continued to remember Dylan not for the way his life ended, but for the dreams he carried with him. Friends and relatives often describe him as a young man who wasn't afraid of hard work, someone who chose an isolated life because he genuinely loved farming. At an age when many people were still deciding their future, Dylan had already committed himself to building something meaningful with his own hands. The case also demonstrated how modern investigations increasingly rely on digital evidence. Cell phone data, forensic DNA testing, and electronic records became essential pieces of the investigation. Combined with traditional detective work and persistent searching, they helped build the case even before Dylan's remains were located. At the same time, the investigation highlighted the determination of Dylan's family. They refused to allow the case to fade from public attention, organized search efforts, spoke regularly with investigators, and continued asking for answers long after many missing person cases received less public attention. Their persistence played an important role in keeping the investigation active until a resolution was finally reached. Today, the remote fields near Lucin are once again quiet. The machinery has stopped, the search teams are gone, and the investigation has officially come to an end. But for those who knew Dylan Rounds, the memory of the ambitious young farmer remains far stronger than the crime that ended his life. His story serves as a reminder that even in the most isolated places, the search for justice can continue for years. Through determined investigators, advancing forensic science, and a family that never gave up hope, the truth eventually came to light. Although nothing can undo the events of Memorial Day weekend in 2022, Dylan's family finally received the answers they had spent nearly 2 years seeking. They were able to bring their son home, lay him to rest, and ensure that the young man who dreamed of building a farm in the Utah desert would not simply be remembered as a missing person, but as someone whose life, work, and determination will not be forgotten.